Welcome to the Culture Perth and Kinross podcast for the second instalment of our special Strathearn Festival of the Arts series. Today we rejoin Dr. Nicky Small and Gil Martin from the Drovers Tryst as they continue their walk along the drove roads of Strathearn.
What I'm interested in really is the life of a drover. This is fascinating because what do we know about these people? Who are they? How do they live and how do they do this job? I have a vision of a man on a horse, but I'm probably wrong. Does he have dogs? I mean, do they follow like a wee entourage? Is he a sole chap? How does he keep a control of all these cows and beasts, you know, bringing them down? And how does that job develop over time? I want to get an idea of who they are and how they did this job because it's quite extraordinary.
You're absolutely right. The drover, as such, was a very capable individual. They had to have a whole range of skills to do their job. Invariably men. You are right by saying that they probably didn't have a horse. They walked. The more affluent drover would probably have a horse. The dealer who was involved in the trade transactions would probably have a horse. But the drover would have really what they could carry.
Mm-hmm.
There would also be boys who would participate in the droving, learning the trade. Yes, they would have dogs. The dogs would be very necessary to keep the cattle in check and to help the droving process. These individuals were very hardy. They drove cattle as a profession. They had to have a whole range of skills to understand how to move the cattle forward, where to get the cattle moving through the glens. They were not well educated because they had probably started the droving activity
As boys themselves. Yeah.
They could perhaps read a bit, but I doubt they could write. But they were very capable in the tasks that they had to do.
So they're going out to places like, you know, small farms or crofts or whatever there would be and taking maybe just a few cows to start with, a few beasts and bringing them together and you're talking about bringing them from Skye as well, so they're bringing them over the water initially, or?
Yes, the middle of the summer, July, August, would be the very start of the collection process. Obviously further afield, Skye and Sutherland, you have to start early because you're a long way away.
Yeah.
And
they've got a deadline they've got to get to.
Got to get to, in the sense of, in case of Crieff, it was the end of September, early October market.
Okay.
That market would be about a week long. So if you're coming from Skye, you would have to start your journey a couple of weeks beforehand, allowing for any mishaps. But the aggregation of those animals would take place over the weeks beforehand.
Before this.
Not only the aggregation of the animals, but also the trading and the dealing that would take place.
And the drover did that too.
The drover would participate in that, but there were also dealers and tacksmen.
Who would catch up with the drover at certain places then?
Would be part of a communication system
Right.
that would probably almost entirely verbal, to understand that there would be an opportunity to acquire some cattle at a certain location, and the drover would pick those cattle and participate in taking them to invariably a holding area. I mean, this isn't something that can be done in a linear sense. You don't start in Sutherland and collect all your cattle in a nice neat order that you think you might be able to do today. This was a very jumbled process.
And how on earth does he keep track of them all? How does he know, you know, what belongs to whoever and what's going where? I mean that's all part of the drover's skill then. He understands all the beasts and sees them all coming in. And
I think, like most farmers, you
know your own.
herdsmen, you know your own beast, but these weren't their own beasts. These were new beasts to them. This was handing a package on from one person to the next.
And these animals are going for meat, so you're not moving the same animals every year. Obviously, you know, they're not going to be sold and then redistributed to do different things. These are all going for slaughter, so they're all making this journey once. So the animals don't know the route either. I mean, it's not like something that they remember every I don't know what I'm trying to say.
This is a one-way ticket.
It's a one-way ticket.
You're absolutely right. And not only is it not a solid herd that has grown up together, it's a different route. And that route changes depending on the weather. It changes depending on exactly what time of the season that the cattle are moving through.
So too much rain and he'll avoid some routes, or if there's good grazing somewhere else, he might actually take a different route to make sure he gets
Historically, there were very few bridges across rivers. Those bridges that did exist were either very narrow stone bridges or wooden bridges. Cattle do not like moving through that type of space. So the drover would, if possible, try and ford
the river.
or swim across, or take advantage of ferries where they could.
And would they be welcome when they arrived, the drovers, or would they be seen as a nuisance, all these beasts and animals arriving and people, or would they be... They'd bring news, surely. Socially, they'd be quite important, would
Probably
they not?
a bit of both.
Bit of both?
I think there are stories of drovers, a bit like a sports team, I suppose,
Yeah.
just landing on locations and just taking over, sleeping in the house and taking the food. And of course, it was a sense of a bit wild, to say the least.
Yeah. It's a solitary kind of life, though, is it not? I mean, they're not terribly sociable people, are they? I mean, if you like living on your own like that and moving through the countryside, is nomadic almost, isn't it?
Yes, I think there would be loners. They certainly would have very few airs and graces. But I think there was an understanding later on in the droving history that this was a necessary part of the economic activities in Scotland. Initially, there was reluctance to accept it. Then it was grudgingly accepted. But when the trade started going with large numbers, the latter days of Crieff and certainly the Falkirk markets, it was recognised this was a major earning opportunity for the Scottish
And a lot
economy.
more happens than just cattle trading, isn't there, when those kind of people get together? There's an awful lot going on in a town, as well as the kind of... I mean, I'm thinking more to sort of Perth being a market town and the bull sales, so, the farming community, the people that are buying and selling come in, but, I mean, a huge amount more then happens. There's accommodation, there's all sorts of other things. People are meeting and socialising and talking, and there's all sorts of social activity that builds up around that. I mean, I would say you do all your purchasing for your household and other things at the same time.
There'd be no newspapers, there'd be no television or radio, and certainly no internet. And so it was the opportunity, an ideal opportunity for a blether
and
an opportunity to find out what was going elsewhere.
I think the taverns did quite well.
Absolutely. Remember, what we have to also mention, the fact this was layered over by the whole Jacobite era,
of course,
and there was lots going on in Scotland. Lots of good things, lots of bad things going on, and people would, for their own welfare, want to be aware of where things were going and how things were lying.
So getting their news and current affairs,
they could move with the times, and they could also make the right informed judgment and decision about matters. Coming out of the north without any news must have meant it was quite difficult for the drovers when they arrived at a town or a village or a settlement. Would they be welcome? Would they be interested in them? What had just happened? If we look at Crieff, right through the middle of the droving period and the success of the Crieff markets, overlaid on that is the Jacobite times. Crieff was burnt in
the burning
1716 and the burning of Strathearn. But despite that, the droving seemed to have continued, and I think there was a sort of implicit acceptance that it was something that had to happen. So the drovers, interestingly, as individuals, and talking about what they wore, they would have the plaid, they would have some footwear, they would not have a great deal of equipment, but they would have a claymore, they might have a pistol. And interestingly, during the 1720s, Wade, when he was building his roads, gave the drovers licenses to carry arms at a time when the government was trying to restrict weapons throughout Scotland.
So he was allowed to carry weapons.
He gave drovers, I think he issued 200-300 licenses to drovers to allow them to carry weapons for their own protection, but also the protection of their goods.
They're good. Of course, it is. And what I mean, when the drover gets to Crieff, I mean, it's a monumental journey to get that far, but that's not the end of it for him. What happens then? The market happens in September, but the animals are sold and moved on, so they're moving south then, as you told me.
That's right.
The drover goes with them, or he hands them over to another drover.
Either the drover would, as these groups of cattle were aggregated into, we call them super herds, but larger herds. And as they came out of the highlands from drove routes to more organised roads, they would group into larger units, and they would either be the same drover would take them all the way. There were stories of drovers going all the way from Skye to Norfolk, or that group would be passed on. I would imagine it was probably up to the dealer to decide how that group would move
happens.
And whether there would be aggregation. But the drovers themselves, once they reached Crieff, they would be part of the organising an attractive and successful transaction, they would make sure the cattle were presented. Obviously, they would have to manage the holding of those cattle.
And they can't all be in great condition after a journey like that. I mean, animals like that aren't meant to be walked for months or weeks, or whatever. I mean, what kind of condition are the animals in? Are they got to be fattened up then before, or are they?
Well, if you move an animal, it will lose weight. The cattle were coming out of the north and the west from lands which were not very productive for cattle rearing. They were moving those cattle to the south to put them to better pasture. So by the time a herd had got to the south, to Herefordshire and to Norfolk and London, they would be in a fairly sorry state, hence the need to overwinter them.
Fatten them up again.
They'd probably get to the south the end of the year. They would be fattened up in the spring for slaughter.
Right. And the drover then, would he come home to start it all over again, and he would travel the length of the country to come home once he's delivered his cattle down south? That would be him. He would set off to begin again.
They would come home.
Would they live up here? I mean, where are their homes? Are they living in Highlands of Scotland, or are they?
The drovers would be from the north. They would be Highlanders. The difficult part of the droving process is from the north to the first markets of Crieff and Falkirk. Thereafter, you're effectively on the motorway, and you head south and just follow the queue. And there's more people, there's more information to tell you. And those routes were very much...
they're more established.
Established because of other forms of trade as well.
Right.
Out of the Highlands, there were no proper roads as such.
So it's very specialised for them to do that part of the job as well.
Yes, and there's stories of drovers staying over in the south and doing other jobs. The wonderful story about the dogs, and we all love dogs.
What's that?
That there was an understanding that at certain times during the droving process, the dog would be released because it was surplus to requirement for that particular drover, and the dog would find its way home.
Oh, it would go home on its own?
And we do hear modern stories of dogs being able to travel considerable distances to find their home, and some form of unique navigation system is being used. We don't really understand how they do it, but the stories of the dogs being released and finding their way back to their home, and as they found their way back to their home, obviously they would...
Thanks for listening. Join us tomorrow for another very special episode of the Culture Perth and Ross podcast.
Would pay the dues, pay the bar bill for the dog.
Brilliant, I love that.
So it's a lovely story.
He sends his dog home before him, that's great. It's quite a remarkable life actually, isn't it? I mean, I know that they've recreated some of the huge lorry going by now. They've recreated some of the droving routes with actual cattle. I've seen that done in the past. Obviously using Highland cows, I think they used, and not the same again in terms of animals, but it's quite amazing to see that, and your Strathearn and Crieff Drovers Tryst, revisits these routes to sort of walk them and take note of all sorts of things, the history as well as the kind of natural world as well. But can you envisage them walking with, all that cattle, keeping it all going and, moving it all down the glen? It's hard going, isn't it?
You have to take your hat off to the ability of these drovers to keep the herd moving, to keep an eye on each of the cattle. If cattle started to go lame, they would shod them with leather. When cattle came to walk on the harder roads, they would put metal on the feet in order to protect the cattle. The cattle don't like moving like a shoe, just on the edge of the hoof. Cattle don't like walking on a hard surface, and it would affect them quite considerably. It's hard enough, I think, as a farrier trying to shod a horse, but trying to put a shoe on cattle. I think the stories are that these cattle were just dumped on their back. And
well, they're quite small. Again, we've got to remember they're a different kind of breed than we're aware of today, aren't they?
So
I think we've got some in our collections. We've got some photographs of old, photographs of cattle and old, and they do look quite different. Even not even the age of obviously what we're talking about here, but smaller animals, sturdier, a different build of beasts and things. So they're quite
and
different.
They were the forerunner of the photo perfect Highland coo, which has a wonderful temperament. So they were
placid,
amenable to being able to be moved along.
And tell me, we've got this idea of a drover. They still use this word in Australia, don't they? I mean, the drovers are known over there. So, is this where it all originated? Did we send them out as cowboys?
Could be. I think certainly parts of Scotland during the droving era had elements of the Wild West. And I think, obviously, when the whole process of droving came to an end, probably the start of the railways.
Moving cattle in a different
Cattle
way.
were able to be moved by rail. A lot of drovers and the legacy of droving had nowhere to go. At the same time, of course, you have immense amounts of migration from Scotland to all parts of the world. And so the drover had a very, very capable skill set that could be used
all over.
And once you start
Part
to
of
get
that
to the
Scottish diaspora again, sending out that skill set into the world.
you get to the wide open plains of the States, and you get to the wide spaces of Australia, the capabilities of a drover were probably in considerable demand.
And do you get people from these communities coming back to the Drovers Tryst? Do they come to the festival over the years you've been running to explore where droving really started?
Yes, that and Scottish history.
Yeah.
You have people from all over the world come to look up their ancestors and look at where they've come from, and people with Drummond and Murray names and local names. They're all coming back, and they're.
But it's great to do the walking festival, because then you're getting out into the countryside and enjoying all those kind of aspects along with that.
Well, we live in a very beautiful part of the world, and we are lucky to be able to roam free and enjoy our history and heritage.
Well, we'll carry on walking up the hill and just enjoy the walk a bit further, because and try and imagine it without the houses and without the odd car coming through the glen and all the rest of it, and try and get ourselves back to when the drovers would have been pushing cattle through here and not anything else. Thanks, Gil, for that.
Thanks for listening. Join us tomorrow for another very special episode of the Culture Perth and Kinross podcast.